Dramatic video captured by Ashish Malhotra late night on Friday in Washington, D.C. Protesters pulled down the statue of Confederate General Albert Pike. In the last few weeks, dozens of monuments have come down. They've been pulled down. They've been defaced. How should we handle contentious markers of our past? That is our discussion today. I'm Femi OK. You're watching the stream. If you are on YouTube right now, jump in the chat and you too can be part of this conversation. So I am going to introduce the guests and they will introduce themselves to you. Hello there, Julian. Tell the world who you are.
I'm a historian and associate professor of leadership studies at the University of Richmond in Virginia, in the United States of America.
Good to have you. Hello, Stephanie. Tell everybody who you are.
I'm Stephanie Collingwood-Williams. I'm the spokesperson for Belgium Network for Black Lives. I'm also a social worker, anthropologist, and grassroots activist.
I have to explain that there is more than one Femi in today's conversation. So when I say hello, Femi, tell everybody who you are. I am not speaking to myself. Hi there, Femi. Introduce yourself.
Hi, other Femi. I'm Femi Olawale. I'm an activist around Brexit. I've been campaigning for around 3-4 years, and I'm also a regular guest on the Pledge on Sky News. And I'm here in Solihull in South Birmingham, UK.
Good to have you. Julian, when you saw that Confederate General Albert Pike in Washington, D.C. coming down, as an historian, what was your head saying? What was your heart saying?
Well, I think in order to really understand the gravity of the moment, you have to recognize that those statues recognize or actually symbolize a story or a narrative of one in which the America tore itself apart in the twilight of the 19th century. And the South may have lost the Civil War, but in many ways it won the civil peace. And part of that victory was the reclamation of public space. So what you're seeing on the one hand are people finally beginning to do their due diligence in contesting this long victory, Southern victory over the civil peace and public space. On the other hand, you're seeing the beginning of something much more profound. And I think that is people coming to terms with the continuation of white supremacy in the United States, this country's tortured racial history, which has been with us from the beginning, and then the association between this statuary, Confederate iconography, and these problems.
I'm going to bring in Femi, you here, and put something on Twitter to you. I know this is a normal thing for you to do, doing battle on Twitter. Earthdog, back here on my laptop, says, alongside the reporting of statues being removed, voluntarily or otherwise, there needs to be a clear individual explanation as to why, because otherwise only the action is seen. I'm just going to bring him back here to Bristol, which is not too far away from you. The protesters in Bristol, for example, would have done far more good for the cause if one of them had approached a news crew and given a clear, calm reason as to what they were doing to Colston's statue. I'll show you some pictures of Colston's statue in a moment, but he was the slave merchant from Bristol, and much of Bristol's wealth in the UK port city of Bristol came from slavery. So the idea of, so they pulled him down, they dunked him in the water, Femi, but does there need to be a better explanation for what was going on?
I'm sorry, this is the thing that you regularly see, attempts to delegitimize movements. It happens with Black Lives Matter. They say, well, you don't have any clear demands, even though the essence of the markers of systemic racism are very clear and legal changes can be put in place to fix them. And in this particular case, it's very obvious why people in the Black Lives Matter do not want his statue in a public place, because the man his company enslaved 80,000 people. He's responsible for around 20,000 deaths of Black innocent people, many of whom were thrown overboard to the ocean to their deaths. So it's very clear why that statue was brought down. The argument that they weren't giving a clear explanation as to why is simply an attempt to delegitimize the cause.
Let me just bring in here Amira Conrad. Amira Conrad is an activist. She also makes incredible theatre, and she talked and she protested against a statue of Cecil Rhodes at Cape Town University. This is what she told us from a South African perspective as she's looking at these monuments around the world coming down.
I think that taking down the statues of racists and oppressors and imperialists all around the world is a very important first step in dismantling systemic and institutionalized racism and really just decolonizing the way that we look at the world and the way that we look at history. I also think that it's not just a quick fix, and we need to think about going deeper into these problems. And really, Black people, people of color, and Indigenous activists have already been having these conversations around the world. We just haven't really been listening to them. And it's high time that we did.
Stephanie, how is this playing out in Belgium? Unpopular monuments coming down, discussions about monuments coming down. I know you have a particular perspective on here and a particular person, historical person, who is now very controversial.
Yeah, so in Belgium we have Leopold II, who killed more people than Hitler did, so over from 10 to 15 million Congolese people, and these lives seem to not matter. So for us, it's also about recognizing the lives of Congolese people, and this historically being put in the right context. So we actually want these lives to still matter, just as well as the Black lives on the European borders and other Black lives that we cease to or refuse to talk about in Belgium.
There is some pushback, though, Julian, about ideas of statues just literally coming down. And one of them is the idea that it's vandalism and you really should be honoring history. Let me just put in a little clip here from President Trump, because on Saturday, he responded to the DC statue of Albert Pike now lying on the ground and being defaced, and it was burned as well. Here's President Trump.
The unhinged left-wing mob is trying to vandalize our history, desecrate our monuments, our beautiful monuments, tear down our statues, and punish, cancel, and persecute anyone who does not conform to their demands for absolute and total control. We're not conforming. That's why we're here, actually.
Julian, the law and order argument. Pick it up.
He's partly right. There's a full-fledged attack on people who have fed up with the sin of omission and the mythologies that characterize things like the lost cause of the Confederacy, the whitewashing of American colonial and imperialist history. You can crack open a textbook from the mid-20th century. There are no people of color. There are no narratives that comport with or try to tell the story of millions of individuals who were essential not only to Caribbean life, but South American life and North American life as forced laborers. And in some ways, I think people have had enough of that in large part because what we're seeing is the reemergence of white supremacy in the United States, the reemergence of fascism in Europe. And I think it belies in some ways what where many people thought we'd be in the 21st century. So I would say there's a bit of status anxiety in the United States, in large part because there are people who are indoctrinated by these mythologies to think this is a white person's country for white people, and it will always be that way. And as we trend majority minority, I think a lot of these people are anxious about where the United States is heading. So there's been Donald Trump is a shockingly predictable result of this anxiety. And I think what you heard right.
Let me put some.
These people from
Yeah, I hear you. Let me put some YouTube comments to you, Julian, and also to Stephanie. Stephanie, go ahead.
Yeah, this whole idea of history being erased is just, it's just not coherent at all. Like, Belgium's history can never be erased. It's not by taking down statues that anything changes. I mean, Belgium's riches were built on this colonial story, and it's not by taking down statues that it changes the woodwork of how the world was made. So it's basically another argument to not talk about the actual things that we are pulling down. We're pulling down white supremacy. We're saying no to systemic racism. And this takes different roles on different levels. It's not only statues, it's police brutality. It's taking down all the systemic violence that people of color have suffered, not only now, but for decades.
Let me introduce Yeah, Julian, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the assumption that, many of these disciplines were created to bolster white supremacist ideas, right? And the idea that somehow people demanding that their stories be told is tantamount to erasing history, I think is absurd. Minorities were not just absent, right? When they were shown in the way that history was told historically, they were inconsequential and dehumanized figures. And for these individuals, many of whom have repatriated back to these imperialist countries in Europe to demand a more robust story,
Julian, what's the more robust story? Once you've taken down these controversial characters, these statues, what is the more robust story? What does that even mean?
We got to deal with like the Enlightenment. You're going to take Hegel, take many of these philosophers that are lionized by Europe. They had some pretty caustic things to say about Africans, for instance. So a continent that was for whose histories were told without event, without agency. I think it's due time that people begin to recognize this kind of diverse tapestry that characterized not just European and Western history. That other people had a role to play in how the world evolved. And I think, especially in the United States, I can't speak for Europe, history is one of the worst taught subjects in the K through 12 system. And there are people who grow up to be full-fledged adults who are wholly ignorant, in large part because the way the history is taught of these stories.
Julian, you make such a great point here. James Dolman says on Twitter, more people have learned about the reality of slavery in the 3 days since Edward Colston's statue was thrown in the sea, that's in Bristol, than they did in the 150 years that it was standing there. Nobody even knew who he was. Let me talk more about history and go to the Gold Coast, to West Africa, to Anthony Boadi, who gives tours of the slave fort on the coast of Ghana. And he has a very particular view on what we should do with controversial monuments. Here he is.
It is very imperative to protect history, no matter how tragic it is. It is wrong for anti-racism protesters to tear down statues, but I understand. I call for heritage authorities to create more museums of this historical nature and to portray the history of the transatlantic slave trade. The history of the transatlantic slave trade is very cruel. It is diabolical. However, we have to understand what happened in the past in order not to repeat.
Femi, go ahead.
Yeah.
Julian is bursting, but Femi, you go first. Julian, you go second.
All right.
I'd agree with the principle of we shouldn't erase history. I'd also agree with the principle that if a crime has been committed, a crime has been committed. The only question is, what do you do when faced with protesters who have torn down a statue, which technically at the time breaks the law? You have to look at the situation holistically. We have a country where it is currently legally allowed to have statues of racist mass murderers in the centers of town squares. That is the larger wrong here. So as a government, you can either change the law so that statue should never have been in a public space other than a museum, or you can go after those who tore it down. Those are your choices.
Julian?
Yeah, I think, a lot of people on a very fundamental level struggle to grapple with what history is. I mean, we're not talking about whitewashing or erasing historical facts, things that actually happened. I think we need to start recognizing that history is essentially the study of history is a collection of memories. They're analyzed and reduced into meaningful conclusions. What people are really driving at right now are the collection of memories that historical actors chose, right? And who was celebrated, who was lionized, and in some ways, who was victimized by the sin of omission. And I think dealing with these statues is a way to begin to not only get people to tell other stories, but to get people to think more intently about what the actual process of history is and how that might help us move forward in these diversifying societies.
It's really clear that this moment is impacting lots of people around the world with the legacies of their various different histories, whether it be European colonialism, whether it be the Civil War in the US. And I want you to hear from Apollo. He's in East Africa, he's in Uganda, and he signed on to a petition to remove statues that are in Uganda in East Africa. Here's his take.
My name is Apollo Makubia. I am a lawyer in Uganda and one of many people who have signed a petition to remove certain colonial street names, monuments, and other symbols. These symbols represent an order, a colonial legacy that was responsible for many atrocities in our part of the world and don't deserve the honor and glory that we give them. We need to remove them and keep them in museums, but also recognize the efforts and work of other Ugandans that promote peace, justice, and freedom.
Yeah.
Let's say something slightly controversial. I want
to. Ginny, I feel like we've touched a nerve here. Go ahead.
You know, when people are waging war on statues, they're not really waging war on the statue, but a story. But I do think it is imperative that we not tell the story of colonialism, imperialism, as if the subjects of those colonialist imperatives were like didn't have agency, right? I mean, at the height of the British Raj, how many English were in India, right? I think they made deals with people, and there were people in subjugated communities who played a part in colonial systems. It's a fact. I mean, you know, when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, Africans, I mean, this wasn't a snatching. You don't have that type of systematic movement of human beings without Africans playing a part in the slave trade. And these are complicated stories of people in places of color who actually worked hand in hand. I'm not saying the historian of Africa or the culture will do these things, right?
All right, let me just bring in Stephanie here. On Twitter, this comment from Den the Artist. So Den the Artist says on Twitter, I say take them down, but don't destroy them. Put them all in a museum and call the museum America's Mirror. Educate all on the wickedness of America's past so we will not repeat it. Destroying and erasing history, good or bad, is a very dangerous path. I want to look at this bit though, Stephanie, from your perspective in Belgium. I say take them down, but don't destroy them. Are you okay with these monuments being pulled down, graffiti on them, being burned? Are you okay with that?
I mean, I think everyone struggles and does their struggle their own way, and that there's no like hierarchy in like this is a better way or a worse way how to like show your voice or struggle. And I also feel like we don't have those museums in Belgium. We have like Tervuren Museum, which is also problematic and people don't agree with. So we don't have those museums that are accountable and do tell the story in a way that we can respect.
So what would you do with those controversial spaces, or what would you create? Or do you just want them all to come falling down, Stephanie?
I'd like all of them come down, as well as the street names, and I'd also like them to be replaced by, you know, people that were actually, we can be proud of as like a Belgian people, you know, like Patrice Lumumba is also someone that we can look up to that was also murdered by the Belgian state. So instead of honoring and glorifying and also normalizing racism in our society, I would like us to put people that we can actually be proud of and that also are like part of the story that we want to tell about ourselves, and not the story of violence, not the story of like hate, not the story of like non-recognition. So I think this continuation of having it normal and being there is just unacceptable.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because you don't build a statue of somebody you hate. You build a statue of somebody who your society believes is a role model for your society. So the fact that we still have those statues up sends the message that we still think that these people are people to aspire to. What we should do is replace those public spaces with the statues, as Stephanie just said, of people who do represent modern day values.
Can I just push back gently, just for the sake of a decent argument? I think is there a lack of imagination when we talk about statuary, and why not use the scale and grandeur of some of these structures against themselves, right? To tell a more robust story that takes all these things into account. Which isn't to say that I'm in disagreement with what's taking place, but it seems to me there's an acute lack of imagination when we talk about monuments. Either tear them down or leave them as they are, as if there's nothing in between that we could do to tell a story that delineates everything that we've just discussed. Right.
Julie, a lot of people watching this online are saying that taking the statues down won't change anything.
Well, listen, We know this in the United States quite well, right? After the massacre in Charleston, they took down the Confederate flag. They took down General Robert E. Lee, who led the Confederacy in New Orleans. Those cities are no less racist than they were before those icons were removed. I think unless these initiatives are met with a type of institutional will and activism to follow through after these statues come down, like I said, it's a wasted opportunity. This is part of a much broader movement. You can't get caught up in the political symbolism of taking these down without carrying it forward.
I'm so glad you said that. Nell Augustine Tupats. Hi there, Nell. Nell says people are tired of dialogue to address racial discrimination. They've resorted to bold action now. To what extent can this Black movement go in the future? Femi.
So the statues, pulling down the statues, we discussed the morality of it. I do take Julian's point in terms of we could use those statues by the plaques that are there to say, look, this person enslaved this number of people, murdered this number of people, and that could actually be a monument to all the things that have been done wrong in our past. But in terms of the conversation around this, yeah, it's been a distraction. I mean, we've seen the people on the right of UK politics and in America basically jump on this as a chance to wage what they see as a massive culture war. The people who are really proud of our history versus people who say, no, this doesn't represent who we are today.
Right.
And it acts as a massive distraction from actually dealing with systemic racism, because as Julian just mentioned, even if you get rid of every single racist statue in the country, systemic racism will still be there. You'll still have Black people disproportionately stopped by police. You'll still have Black people stopped from advancing in their careers because they don't have the right sounding name. Those things will still be there long after the statues are gone. So we should divert our focus back to the real issues.
If the Western world had done something meaningful about its tortured racial history, all this stuff would be a punchline, right? Those statues would be a punch. I believe that. I think the fact that we're having this discussion is because there's something inherently wrong with 21st century societies, and that people are still treated as second-class citizens. I think had we actually done something meaningful around issues of race, we might not be at this moment, right?
But I am glad that we are guests, because it's been a really, to quote the historian, robust conversation. Julian, Stephanie, the other Femi, thank you so much. YouTube, thank you for engaging. Really appreciate you. That wraps up this episode of The Stream. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Take care, everybody.